Hello and welcome to this episode. Hello and welcome to this episode of the Diary of a Lawyer. And I want to talk about the issue of the Supreme Court in the United States. And this follows the most recent decisions, which are now almost a year ago, that were transformational and caused a lot of debate, to say the very least, public debate all over the world. One of which was around the case of Roe v. Wade, which is a case of um, regarding abortion, and the other that relates to voting rights, gun rights, etc., etc. But the Kachin has run, which appears to be a serialization or a review of a book by Mike Waldman, and the title is The Supermajority Review: How the Supreme Court Trumped America. And the author is Michael, according to, the title goes, Michael Waldman delivers a terrific, chilling account of how conservatives hijacked the US democracy. Um, he is a lawyer and president of the Brennan Center for Justice at New York University School of Law, and also a historian. And essentially, the review starts by mentioning that the book focuses the what he calls horrendous decisions the court has rendered at the end of its term 1 year ago, as I mentioned, but also includes a big history of the court's last 200 years, from what he calls the disastrous laws of Dred Scott versus Stanford, which is 1857, and Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896, to Brown v. Board of Education, 1952, which essentially was the segregation or desegregation of the school system, and most recently, Obergefell versus Hodges, 2015. The longest analysis, however, was devoted to the last 3 days in June 2022, when what he terms as decades of social change were crammed into 3 days. And the writers quoted as saying that the court overturned Roe v. Wade abortion, putting at risk all other privacy rights, which radically loosened curbs on guns right in the middle of the epidemic of mass shootings, and also hope of the ability of government agencies to protect public health and safety change. And unquote. He goes on to say that the decision was the work of a little group of willful men and women, ripping up long settled aspects of American life for no reason beyond the fact that they can. Again, those are his words. And he goes on to describe how extreme decisions by the Supreme Court provoked gigantic or major national backlashes. Now, before we go into the actual decision, we also have to understand that this is in the context of the ongoing intrinsic focus on the specific Supreme Court charges in terms of their alleged associated or suspected conflict of interest with different funders, gifts, and trips, etc., etc. So all the things sort of together with, in concept with the key decision, transformational decisions in what Autumn calls crowning 3 days, decades of social change into 3 days, have put in peril the perceptions, public perception of the US Supreme Court as a bastion of, as a defender and bastion of impartiality, and therefore defending democracy, especially in the last few years where American democracy has been shaken to its core. It goes back to the Civil War, which started 4 years after the court held in a case called Dred's Court that African Americans could not sue in federal court because they could not be citizens of the United States. That in May 1935, what is called as quote-unquote Black Monday decisions obliterated key parts of Frank Roosevelt's bill, which also struck down the National Recovery Administration, rulings that led to the unsuccessful plan of the then President Roosevelt to expand the size of the court, but consequently led to the court to reverse its position on the need to suddenly upheld Social Security and the National Labor Relations Act, which referred to the number of injustices on the court, which led to description of the injustice on the court by the then one newspaper humorist called quote unquote the switch in time that saved 9, meaning the reverse of the Supreme Court that saved the court from being expanded beyond the 9 justices. The author Woodman goes on to describe the current makeup of the court as the ultimate outcome of the longest backlash of all, the one to the court that led Al Warren, who crafted the unanimous opinion in Brown, outlawing segregation in public decisions. He refers to equally important decisions that required legislative districts to have equal populations. He mentions that Reynolds versus Sims in 1964, nearly 40% of the population of California lived in Los Angeles, but the state constitution awarded the county just one of the 40 state senators, proclaiming the revolutionary doctrine of what one person on board. The court said that legislators represent people, not trees or acres. And by 1968, 1993 of 99 state legislature chambers had withdrawn their districts to comply. But apparently these vital building blocks of modern American democracy had coincided with also the democratic changes in the 1960s, which included the fight for racial equality and the explosion of sexual freedom. And the backlash to the 1960s lasted much longer than 1960 did, as Waldman observes. And the current generation have lived in those outcomes. However, 1868 next campaign was supposed to capitalize on the backlash when a young campaign aide explained the plan to journalist. He said the whole sector of politics was knowing who hates who, a theory that apparently has led to the ascendance of Donald Trump. And he goes on to describe the problem that the energy on the left dissipated after the election of Nixon, and instead, 50 years later, the energy of that social push has been on the right, where recent amounts of money and think tanks have found themselves into the process, lobbyists, and choosing candidates for public office, including, as we know, candidates for, in some ways, directly or indirectly, for the Supreme Court. And he cites an example of Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission in 2010, when five justices, including Roberts, did a century of campaign finance law. And Citizens United made it possible for corporations and unions to spend unlimited sums publicly, plausibly pretend that they were independent of the candidate they backed. And he says that proved the illustrious presidential contenders raised hundreds of millions of dollars for campaigns, all of it supposedly independent. And that was the beginning of the robust majority use of the First Amendment of free speech to undermine democracy, which is a constitutional contradiction. And 2 years after the Citizens United, the court eliminated the long-standing cap on the amount individuals could give to the federal court. So these rulings remade by American politics as well human rights in a new gilded age of fantastically concentrated wealth. Billions again dominate the electoral system. And the shift was dramatic in that it was dramatic in that in 2010, billionaires spent about 31 million in federal races, and a decade later they spent almost 2.2 billion. And last year, Peter Thiel provided nearly 30 million in independent funds to support J.D. Vance in Ohio and Blackbusters in Arizona. And the author goes on to conclude that the court has become a serious threat to American democracy, and he suggests that the many based theory on the impact of the Supreme Court on the process has shaken to the core the American democracy. And he suggests that the only hope is that the democratic successes in last year's midterms, many based on the fury over the fall of Roe v. Wade, marked the beginning of the backlash against the right revolution the court now apparently shamelessly promotes. And so that is an account of a well-established lawyer, a jurist, and historian giving an account of how the U.S. Supreme Court, in its 3 days of what some would call judicial madness, where decades of social safety nets were shredded within 3 days, and now the ongoing press revelations and the specific aspects of specific judges, given the background of what happened in the attack on the Houses of Congress. It's a wake-up call for that is one of the biggest democracies in terms of having functioning systems, institutions, with the biggest economy, the biggest army. It is a wake-up call to live up to its claim, its image of being that shiny city on the hill to which everyone, the land of the free, to the tired, the weak, the sick, to which they run to, a city on the hill to which all those who seek freedom and justice and a fair share and to uplift their lives run to. And in just that book, Waldron concludes that all that is a peril. In his own words, he says is a serious threat to American democracy, and that's courtesy of the Supreme Court, which should be bastion, guardian, independent, impartial guardian of democracy. So there we shall leave it on this episode of the Diary of a Lawyer, and we shall speak again. Thanks for listening. Bye.